Now we come to Job chapters 18 and 19. Here we have the second speaker in the trio, Bildad, with his second speech. That comprises chapter 18, and then chapter 19 comprises Job's response to Bildad. In chapter 18, verse 3, it sounds like we have Bildad responding to Job's complaint that his friends consist of really poor comforters. So in 18:3, we find Bildad saying, "Why are we counted as cattle? Why are we stupid in your sight?" When we come to verse 5, Bildad takes up the theme of retribution. In fact, he'll devote the remainder of this chapter to a catalog of bad things that happen to wicked people. So it begins in verse 5 of chapter 18. Surely the light of the wicked is put out. The flame of their fire doesn't shine. Light is dark in their tent. Verse 7, strong steps are shortened. Verse 9, a trap seizes them. And let's come to towards the end of chapter 18. Verse 21, surely such are the dwellings of the ungodly that have been described just previously, such as in 19, no offspring or descendant, a terrible curse. 21b, such is the place of those who do not know God. So retribution in this very descriptive catalog is shown to be the operative principle. Wicked people behave badly and then receive painful outcomes as a result. Job will respond in chapter 19, first speaking to Bildad as a conversation partner, not so much on the topic of guilt or innocence, but simply, how are you affecting me as a friend? Chapter 19, verse 2, how long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? Does it not seem like there's an escalation in the degree of candor about the opinion of one group to the other, that is, the friends as one group and Job as the other, their opinion of each other and what they're doing to each other in the course of this debate? Next, Job takes up the one point that was made by Bildad. Retribution is the operative principle in the universe. Bad things happen to bad people. And Job turns to that in verse 6. Know then that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net around me. As you've probably discovered by now, when Job makes this kind of a statement, he's saying, I'm not the one who's done this to myself. It is not for something I have done that I'm suffering, but God has independently decided to bring hardship on me. So it's his way of affirming his own innocence. Just as Bildad in his chapter, his statement in chapter 18, has given us one of the most graphic catalogs or descriptions of hardship suffered by the wicked, now in chapter 19, Job is going to give one of his most graphic descriptions of the hardship that he is going through. Notice, for example, verse 17. My breath is repulsive to my wife. I'm loathsome to my own family. This is getting very personal. 18. Even young children despise me. And when we come to 20, description of his own physical condition. My bones cling to my skin and to my flesh. I've escaped by the skin of my teeth. And then he calls on his friends in 21, have pity on me. Can't you just do that? Have pity on me. And now in the last portion of chapter 19, we come to some of the most famous verses in all of Job, particularly 25 and following. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. After my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold and not another. My heart faints within me. Interpreters offer a variety of explanations for what's being conveyed here. I'll be drawing from two resources and encourage you to consult them to learn more about this. First, I'll present David Klein's viewpoint that is expressed in his excellent Word Biblical Commentary, Volume 1 of Job, that spans chapters 1 through 20. Commenting on these verses, he raises the question, what could this Redeemer be? In order to answer that question, he turns back to a verse in chapter 16, and let's ourselves turn back to 16, in particular verse 19. Here we have chapter 16. Yeah, we're aiming in particular on 19, but let's lead up to it, beginning with verse 17. In 17, he's affirming his innocence. There's no violence in my hands. My prayer is pure. Then in 18, he calls out to the earth in a personification, asking the earth to take action on his behalf. O earth, do not cover my blood. Let my outcry find no resting place. This is an expression which says wrong has been done, and the earth itself is witness to what takes place on it. It is an independent and unbiased witness, and so it can recount what has transpired, as it were, on the stage of the earth, and can therefore present the case accurately for someone who has been wronged. So he's saying, earth, don't hide what has happened here, but rather let it be told. There seems to be some language that's even reminiscent of the death of Abel, where it says, God says to Cain that the earth, out of the earth, Abel's blood cries out. Now, it's not as though Job's blood has been shed, he has not been killed yet, but there is that same imagery of the earth as being capable of voicing a report of what transpired upon it. When we come to verse 19, it reads, even now, in fact, Job says, my witness is in heaven, he that vouches for me is on high. Now, David Klein's reading this says, in view of past portions of Job, where he understands God as being his enemy, diametrically opposed to him, not sustaining justice on his behalf, then that would rule out understanding that some kind of advocacy or witness would be God advocating on Job's behalf. So that leaves, if that door is closed, then Klein says, it must therefore be that Job's litigation, his deposition, as it were, in a legal situation, his declaration of innocence, that entity itself is lodged in heaven as though being deposited in a court of law. And that declaration will act, as it were, as a witness to be, think of it as being replayed later in order to bring up Job's case and declare his innocence, so that this case would have to be handled, would have to be tried. Well, on one layer we must affirm that Klein's observation of Job's perspective of God as being diametrically opposed, unwilling to support Job's innocence, while this on one level would seem to rule out understanding that in chapter 16, verse 19, this witness could have any connection with God himself, notice what John Hartley comments in his New International Commentary on the Old Testament, New International Commentary on the Old Testament, book of Job, as he's commenting on this same passage, chapter 16, verse 19. He says, it's difficult to think that God would serve as witness against himself, and yet, I'm interpreting that as Mowickle argues, the concept is not impossible. So, Hartley acknowledges this goes against some of the line of thinking that we've seen earlier in Job, but we shouldn't rule it out entirely, as in fact Klein's feels obliged to do. Resuming with quotation from Hartley. Here Job appeals to God's holy integrity in stating his earnest hope that God will testify to the truth of his, that is, Job's claims of innocence, even though such testimony will seem to contradict God's own actions. Such risking is the essence of faith. And then later on, Job is affirming genuine confidence in God regardless of the way it appears that God is treating him. So Job, in contrast to his friends, will not concede that truth is identical with appearances. He presses on for a true resolution to his complaint from God himself. It goes without saying that passages like this are not easy to wrestle with. They raise a host of questions. However, in my own experience with wisdom literature, I'm discovering increasingly that the sages are not reluctant to face us into some rather bold paradoxes. they are not reluctant to face us with interpretive choices which do not on the surface make sense. And in so doing, they're acknowledging that part of living is a paradox and that we don't understand all the options that are before us, or we cannot easily tease out solutions to the dilemmas that we encounter. I find the sages not shying away from the paradoxes, but being willing to face into them. And it's entirely possible that the best understanding of Job 16:19 is that somewhere in the back of Job's mind, and could this not be part of God's inspiration of this passage, somewhere in the back of his mind in his faith walk, he had a sneaking suspicion, a foundational conviction that despite the apparent unfairness of God, there was a deeper bedrock, a foundation of justice that would be vindicated, and that somehow in heaven, as it says, my witnesses in heaven, this may not have simply been Job's own declaration of innocence, deposited a deposition in the heavenly court, but that somehow this may have been bound up in the person of God himself, as paradoxical as that seems. Is this not a paradoxical book? Job doesn't know chapters 1, where God and Satan have to begin this test. He's not aware of how this is set up. So he is locked into, as it were, a blind paradox. So we should not be surprised that as he gropes for answers, he may be presenting some solutions which themselves are paradoxical. For us then to insist on straight answer solutions, I believe, is an unfair requirement for a book with the degree of wrestling that is endemic. It's inherent to this particular gift to us, this book of Job. And now we'll take this information from chapter 16 regarding this witness in heaven and bring that to bear on chapter 19. Here we are then in Job 19, returning our attention to verse 25, asking the question, who or what is this Redeemer that lives? Consistent with his understanding of chapter 16, verse 19, the witness in heaven, we find David Klein's recommending a consistent interpretation now then with 1925, so that Job's Redeemer would consist of his deposition in the heavenly court, his affirmation of innocence, and that would stand as a Redeemer to argue his case. It might be worth commenting that Redeemer, the Hebrew word is goel, and the idea of a next of kin who would come to the aid of a family member who was disadvantaged in a variety of ways. And one of the roles of the Redeemer was, in fact, to take up the disadvantaged family member's case in court. And that role fits very nicely with Job's use of the language in 1925. So again, for Klein's, the Redeemer is not a person, but rather Job's, shall we say, affidavit, or his deposition of innocence. I commend to you Klein's careful review of other interpretive options in his book. He does a very nice job of that. And now I'll turn our attention to John Hartley's comment on the same passage. John Hartley takes up the question, beginning by acknowledging that traditional interpretation, quote, has been that Job is identifying God as Redeemer, but several modern interpreters find intolerable the logic of this interpretation that God will help Job against God. And then Hartley goes on to explain how some would understand this, particularly linking back to chapter 16, thinking that the witness was some heavenly being other than God. And then Hartley resumes the conversation. Quote, while this view has much in its favor, it is not able to account for all the facts. As pointed above, the title Redeemer had a special place in Israel's confessional theology. Therefore, the author's choice of this term for Job is an intentional allusion to the special nuances of deliverance and love that are associated with this title for God. Hartley has pointed out, by the way, several passages where God is identified as Goel, as Redeemer. So he understands the writer of Job here as linking to a known identity of God, an identity of God that the audience would have been aware of. It would not have surprised them to think of God as kinsman redeemer, as Goel, and then making that the identity of Goel in this passage as well. Hartley goes on to point out the descriptor alive, and that occurs in our passage, I know that my Redeemer lives or is alive, is living. Quote, as the living one, God both sustains life and acts marvelously for the deliverance of those who serve him. Therefore, the title Living Redeemer, as we find it here in Job, applies to none other than God himself. So you can see from this brief summary that good interpreters differ on this topic, and it's up to us to review the possibilities and draw our own best conclusions. As you may have expected, based on my comfort level for paradoxes within wisdom literature, especially dealing with these skeptical wisdom questions, the problem of evil in the earth, for Job to understand that somehow there is within God himself, within the divine being, a voice for arguing Job's innocence, someone who will go to bat for him as a redeemer. I believe this, though paradoxical within Job, is definitely a very strong, and in my opinion, the best understanding, best solution to the interpretive dilemma that we have before us, and frankly, a very beautiful one. And now, in closing, let's turn our attention to verses 26 and 27. Two perspectives we want to keep in mind as we look at these fascinating and very influential verses. First of all, Job is at the point of chapter 19. He does not know the end of the book, chapter 42, and he most certainly does not know the New Testament. So we want to guard against presuming that Job here has a New Testament understanding of the book. He does not even have a chapter 42 and resolution of his dilemma at this point in the book. Having said that, notice what we find Job expressing in chapter 42, verse 5. Here at the end of, not the end of his life yet, but at the end of his dilemma and debate with God, he says, I had, that is in the past, heard of you by hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What Job was anticipating with some confidence in 19, verse 26, then in my flesh I shall see God. That happens according to chapter 42. So he looked forward to it. He hoped somehow that it would take place, and we find it does. So there's a degree of fulfillment right there. There are overtones here also, and many have long recognized these, of resurrection. Understanding 26, the destruction of skin, as being death, and that in my flesh I see God as resurrection of the body. Again, we've acknowledged Job does not have a New Testament understanding of resurrection, but as we look back on this passage from a New Testament perspective, we see an alarming degree of consonance, a very rich extent of harmony with the experience of Jesus in his own bodily resurrection and what the New Testament teaches will be the experience of those who are the recipients of God's forgiving grace in the resurrection that follows. So we bring to a conclusion our comments looking briefly at chapters 18 and 19 and find some very powerful statements of hope and some anticipation of God's release and God's deliverance, God's vindication, which from where Job stands right now, still in chapter 19, seem too good to believe, too good to be true, and yet there is within him this artesian spring of confidence, which we find will be vindicated This does work out, even within the context of the book, and then from a more massive scale and New Testament perspective on resurrection, we can see this as being a truth that is borne out and fulfilled in God's eventual universal kingdom.